Hey y'all, it's Ben again, and today we're going to talk about offense and defense in LD debate rounds. So, the purpose of today is to provide you sort of a toolbox to work from moving forward when you're both preparing to give rebuttals in your own debate speeches or when you're thinking about what types of arguments your opponent might be making in a debate round. So, we're going to be covering several fundamental types of arguments and the specific terms that are used to describe those arguments in debate rounds. So, you're probably aware at this point that people use a lot of technical vocabulary to describe certain types of arguments or to label arguments when they're debating. So we're going to go through some of that vocabulary today, but specifically we're going to be talking about the types of terms or the types of arguments that can be used to generate offense in a debate round, and then the popular types of arguments that count as defensive arguments in a debate round. So, starting out with offense, then, we spent a lot of time in the last lecture talking about contentions. So, just to briefly review, a contention argument is one of the main substantive arguments you are making in favor of or against the resolution being true or false. So we said that you'll likely have multiple contention level arguments, and each one of these would be independent or semi-independent reasons why you should believe that the resolution is true, so you should affirm the resolution, or why you should negate the resolution. Now, it's important from our last lecture to remember that we said that each contention argument has three main component parts, that it has a claim, a warrant, and an implication. Now, when we talk about how to make defensive arguments against contention level arguments today, and also when we talk about how to generate offense off of contention level arguments, each one of these parts is going to continue to be extremely important. So let's talk about how to go about generating offense off contention level arguments. Now, this may seem like a strange question because what we've said is that contention level arguments are your offensive arguments in the round. But it's really, really crucial that in every rebuttal speech you make throughout a debate round, any contention level argument that you want your judge to be voting on needs to be extended. So, in a rebuttal, what you are essentially doing is A, making responses to your opponent's case, but B, making extensions of your own case so that you're putting in play the pieces of, or the arguments or the pieces of evidence that you want to be evaluated at the end of the round as being relevant to adjudicating the truth or the falsity of the resolution. That is, you are putting into play the arguments that you believe demonstrate that you win. So, generating offense on a contention level argument requires extending it in both rebuttals. So, let's say you're affirming then any contention level argument that you want to be a voting issue at the end of the round, that is, that you want your judge to evaluate, you need to be extending in the 1AR and in the 2AR. So let's use an example. If we are using the resolution resolved, a just government ought to pay reparations to indigenous populations for historical oppression, let's say that I'm making the following argument. My value criteria, let's say, is one about the state needing to be legally accountable to the laws that it creates. So it's something about contractualism or the rule of law being a necessary evaluative function of what a just state would do. So let's say that my contention argument says, based on that, a just state has to follow its treaties and laws. A, the claim would be that the United States or that a government has broken treaties or broken contracts or legal guarantees through historical oppression. Then, in order to restore or resolve the state's accountability to breaking those contractual agreements, we would go on to say that the only way to be a just state, or for the state to become just, is to retroactively fulfill them or do the closest approximate thing. That's my contention level argument. So anytime I wanted to put that argument into play as something that the judge should consider at the end of the round, I would have to do what we call make an extension of that argument. So, in the 1AR and in the 2AR, I would have to signal to my judge to go to that place in the flow. So I would say go to contention 1. And then I would say extend contention 1 and then summarize the claim, the warrant, and the implication of that argument. That is, I would explicitly tell the judge that we were extending the claim, the warrant, and the implication of the argument. So in this case, I would say extend the claim that a just state has to ensure that it follows the treaties and the laws that it puts into place. Then I would say extend the warrant that says that historical oppression equates to the breaking of contracts and the breaking of treaties, and then I would give a substantive warrant, or in the contention level argument, I would have given a substantive warrant for why that's true, for why typically historical oppression of indigenous populations has meant broken treaties, and I would refer, for instance, the genocide of the Native Americans. And then finally, I would say that the implication of that is that because the state has broken its contract, but because it also has to follow its contracts, the only way for the state to go back to being just, or to be compelled to be just, would be by retroactively fulfilling those contracts or doing the closest thing that would approximate that. So, admittedly, this takes some time, but it's really, really important. You will get more efficient at it the more often you do it, that you are extending explicitly the claim, the warrant for the reason the claim is true, and the implication being its explicit link to your value criterion. If you are not doing all three of these things, there is a good possibility that a judge will not evaluate them, especially if the negative debater, or your opponent in any case, stands up and says they did not extend the warrant for this argument, or they did not extend the claim for this argument, or it's linked back to the value criterion, so you shouldn't evaluate it. Now, that might seem outrageously stringent, but in competitive debate rounds, it's often true that I would be reading 2 or 3 warrants for the same argument, or I would be reading multiple implications for the same argument. So in a rebuttal, I might not go for both of those warrants. My opponent may have made compelling arguments against one of the warrants for my contention, but I might go for the second warrant and explain why that means it's still true. And because you can do something like that, it's really necessary that you have to manually extend arguments, or else it would be really impossible for anybody to tell what arguments were supposed to be relevant and what arguments weren't. So, in summary then, what you have to think about when you want your contention levels to actually turn into offense at the end of the day is that you have to keep them in play on the flow. So that means that in the 1AR and in the 2AR, your job as the affirmative debater is to defend the relevant parts of your case against your opponent's attacks, and then go on to explicitly extend those arguments, and then in the 2AR you should explain why they are voting issues, why the judge should consider them as being offense, and where they matter, why they matter in the grand scheme of the round. That is from the sort of big picture. But we'll talk about voting issues more specifically another time, perhaps, but it's important that in the 2AR, you are capitalizing on the work you've done, extending all of these arguments by labeling them as voting issues and explaining why the judge should vote on them in light of all of the other arguments that are in place at that point in the round. So that is the idea behind a contention, and that is the idea behind extending a contention to gather offense. So I just want to say 3 quick things about your contentions in terms of broader rebuttal strategy, just to think about when you're going about trying to make successful contentions and turn things into voting issues. That is, first, that you have to make sure if you're going to extend something that you are responding to your opponent's responses. Otherwise, you're doing what we would call extending through ink, which is just an expression that people use to say that you're claiming that your argument is still true, but you're doing so without substantively engaging with your opponent's responses. Any successful extension of a contention will involve you first going through and refuting your opponent's answers to that. But second, and this is equally important, is you have to remember that if you are strategically building a case, you should not have to win every contention level argument and every warrant for every argument. And if you did, you would have an almost impossible burden as the affirmative debater, especially, but also as the negative debater. It is not pragmatically possible to respond to every argument your opponent makes all the time. I mean, sometimes people can do it, and sometimes people do it, but the more strategic way to go about things oftentimes is picking your battles and doing good weighing and comparative work to demonstrate why the issues that you have won are more important than the issues that you haven't or that you've dropped along the way. So don't feel obligated to extend everything. That is, if you have multiple contentions, you don't necessarily have to go for all three of them every round. If you have multiple warrants for one point, you don't necessarily have to go for all of those warrants. But when you do go for an argument, you have to be extending its claim, its warrant, and its impact. Final thing that I want to stress is that extending an argument is not the same as doing comparative weighing between that argument and other arguments that are being extended as offense in the round. And it's also not the same thing as labeling something a voting issue explicitly. So it's really important to remember that if you want something to be considered as offense in the round, you always have to extend it, but you should be doing work in your rebuttals as well to always be explaining the arguments that you are extending in relationship to other pieces of offense that are sort of on the board, that are being extended on the flow, doing weighing and comparative analysis between the arguments that you're extending and the arguments that your opponent is extending, for instance, and that simply extending something doesn't mean that that argument is going to be considered the end-all be-all of arguments in the round, that you'll also have to be doing work and interacting that argument with other arguments that you're making and that arguments that your opponent is making. But for our purposes now, what we want to stress the most is that in order for something to be counted as offense, you have to perform an extension, that an extension involves extending its claim, its warrant, and its implication, and that you have to make sure that you are both linking that argument that you've extended back to your value criterion and making sure that you've responded to all possible objections to that argument before you've gone through the trouble of extending it, because otherwise there's no reason for the judge to evaluate it because it already has defense on it. So those are contention level arguments. So that's step one. Moving on to the next two types of arguments, or the next type of offensive argument that has two sort of sub-varieties, we need to talk about what we call turns. So in a debate round, the idea behind a turn is that your opponent may oftentimes make arguments that could actually be, under other circumstances, offensive arguments for you. So the idea behind a turn is that you're working to generate offense for yourself off of your opponent's positions or their arguments. So that's why you call it a turn. It's going in one direction and you turn it around and you make it work for you. So there are two types of turns that we need to talk about today. The first type is a link turn, and the second type is an impact turn. So for our example, let's use the resolution, resolved civic disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. Resolved civic disobedience in democracy is morally justified. So let's say we're dealing with a negative argument. And so the negative contention level argument says, civic disobedience leads to the collapse of the rule of law. And the new rule of law is important for blah, blah, blah reasons, or this has X, Y, and Z consequences. So if we were talking about performing a link turn, the idea is that you would turn the interaction between the cause and the effect that the affirmative is positing. So you're going to take the logic, the causal logic that they're saying X thing causes Y thing, civic disobedience leads to the collapse of rule of law, and you would say, in fact, the opposite is true. So a link turn for this argument would be to say, civic disobedience actually restores faith or strengthens the rule of law. So why would that be true? So of course, every time you have to turn something, you have to provide your own warrant and implication for the argument that you're making. But so you can conceptualize this way. So if you were the debater who is responding to this argument, so this is the 1AR, and you're like, you're like, go to the negative contention 1 that says civic disobedience leads to the collapse of rule of law. Turn, civic disobedience actually restores faith in the rule of law because it ensures that laws are just and represent the people, so people are more likely to invest in the law in a circumstance where civic disobedience is allowed to check the law when it's established. So you can see how I'm saying you make this claim. In fact, the opposite is true. So you say that civic disobedience collapses the rule of law because it allows people to violate the law, but I'm saying that allowing people to selectively violate the law without consequences is the way that we give people faith in the law in the first place, because those people then think that that representation is just or responsive to them and not applied in circumstances where they object to it. Now, of course, there are answers to that turn, but you can see how what I'm saying in this circumstance is that the argument that the negative is making, they're correct that the rule of law is important. So I'm saying the impact, the implication that it hurts the rule of law, we should care about that. We should care about the rule of law, but they're wrong about the cause and effect relationship. They're wrong that the resolution would collapse the rule of law. Instead, implementing the resolution restores faith in it. So that's the idea of a link turn, is that you take the link that they're drawing between implementing the resolutional action and a consequence, and you say, in fact, it works the other way around. And that, therefore, should generate offense for you. So underneath their criterion, for instance, that would posit ostensibly that the rule of law is important, you now have offense that links back to it because you've said that you're actually protecting the rule of law better. So that's the idea behind a link turn. When you link turn something, you are generating offense that usually links back to your opponent's criterion. And that's really valuable strategically. And you can think about why that's really valuable strategically, because it means that, let's say your opponent is destroying you on the negative side of, or on your own case, right? They're beating you and have demonstrated pretty soundly that your case is wrong. Well, you have offense that links back to their case now. So you don't necessarily have to win your position as long as you're demonstrating that you're winning their position better than they are, or that independently the turns on their position prove that the resolution is true. So there's a lot of strategic advantage in generating turns then. And that is the idea, or the strategic advantage to making turn arguments in the first place instead of just loads of contention level arguments, is that it gives you another tier on which your offense operates. So you can lose your value criterion but still win offense underneath their value criterion if you're doing this correctly. So the second type of turn we're going to talk about then is an impact turn. And what the impact turn does, as opposed to the link turn, is say, yes, you're correct about the consequence, but actually that consequence has the opposite value that you're assigning to it. That is, if you're saying it's a bad consequence, actually it has a good consequence. Or if you're saying, or that consequence you're labeling is good. Or if you're saying it is a bad consequence, or if you're saying it has a good consequence, actually that consequence is bad. So let me give an example. For instance, we're talking about how this argument about why civic disobedience leads to the collapse of rule of law. So we've said that the link turn would say, no, actually civic disobedience strengthens the rule of law. The impact turn would say the collapse of the rule of law is actually a good thing. The collapse of the rule of law is actually a good thing. So, for instance, you might think of making this argument this way. You would say, turn, the collapse of the rule of law is actually positive because it leads to a government that has the possibility of being minimally oppressive. The government is what creates the most violence, the government is what creates the most oppression through its interventions. So even though we think that the law defines what is morally justified, it's actually the opposite, and that the law creates conditions for oppression. So breaking down the rule of law is key to liberating the people under democracy. So what's important to keep in mind here is that you are saying, in most circumstances, then, that what your opponent is depicting as a negative consequence and linking back to their criterion as being something bad is actually proactively good. So here is going to be more important for you to do substantive impact work. That is, for you to talk in detail about the way in which the impact that you're articulating links back to either your own or your opponent's criterion, or both. So you have to measure it in relationship to the criterions that are in place. And let me explain why this is true. So let's say that the negative is running this rule of law position and using a contractualist argument, or a contractualist value criterion. That is, they are saying that the law is what defines what a just state is, because the state is made up of the contracts that it keeps, so the state can only be legally defined, and its moral obligations can only be legally defined. So if they're saying that's why the rule of law is important to the state, and the rule of law is their value criterion, and then they're saying this collapses the rule of law, if I impact turn it, and I say that collapse of rule of law is good because it creates freedom or minimal oppression, that still wouldn't really link back to their value criterion, because their value criterion is talking about contracts. But that might link back to mine if I'm running something like a utilitarian framework. So if I impact turn the argument and say that it's actually good, I need to be linking it back to my framework in that instance, because it wouldn't apply to theirs. But let's say on the flip side, they're saying that their value criterion is restoring freedom, or protecting freedom, rather, and my impact turn links back to freedom, then I'm saying underneath their own value criterion, what they're talking about is a good thing and not a bad thing. So the most persuasive impact turns are going to be ones that link back to your opponent's value criterion, or to both. Or link back to both criterions in the round. But it's possible to impact turn a position and then link it back to your own value criterion, and that would still count as offense, right? But in one circumstance, in the second instance, I would have to be winning my value criterion for that offense to matter, and in the other instance, I wouldn't be, because I would be linking it back to their position, so it could count as offense for me. So to summarize then, we've talked about two types of turns. The first type of turn is a link turn, where you are saying that the causal logic that they've established between implementing the resolutional action and X consequence actually works the opposite way around. So that same argument should actually count as offense for you, because you are, for instance, helping maintain the rule of law. And then the second type being an impact turn, where we're saying, yeah, the whole logical chain that you've drawn out, the cause and the effect, are both true, but the effect just has the opposite moral value or political value or consequences that you're saying it does, and it's actually a good thing, and then you're explaining how that links to your value and your value criterion. Now, we're going to move on to talk about defensive arguments now, but I want to conclude our discussion here just by reminding you that with turns, you need to be extending them as well. The extension arguments that we've been talking about, or the protocol for making extensions to make offense count that we've talked about so far, also apply to making turns. So if you're turning your opponent's position, if you're link turning it or impact turning it, and you want those turns to count as voting issues at the end of the day, you need to be making sure that you extend them in the rebuttal after you make them. Otherwise, they simply won't count as offense. So, for the duration of this lecture, then, we're going to talk about different types of defensive responses you can make to your opponent's positions. For the sake of example, we're going to keep using the resolution, talking about civic disobedience being morally justified in a democracy, and we're going to be talking through making responses to a particular example just for clarity's sake. So the example that we're going to use is that is going to be a negative argument that says that, much like what we've been talking about so far, allowing for civic disobedience collapses the rule of law. But then expanding it slightly, allowing for civic disobedience collapses the rule of law. Collapsing the rule of law leads to domestic strife, and as a response to domestic strife, martial law or violent oppression would be implemented. So civic disobedience then would cause more harm than it would prevent. This is the argument. And let's say this is operating underneath the utilitarian framework. So violent oppression is bad because it hurts more people than it would help otherwise. Now, we're going to go through a number of different ways that you could defensively respond to this argument, mostly for the sake of illustrating what different types of defensive responses there are. So the first way that people often go about creating defense against their opponent's positions is by making no warrant arguments or contesting the warrants of the claims. So, for instance, here the claim is civic disobedience collapses the rule of law, and theoretically there would be a warrant for that of some kind empirically. Then collapsing the rule of law leads to domestic strife. That's the second part of the argument, the second step of the argument, which also would have an independent warrant. And then in circumstances where there is domestic strife or discord, we see the implementation of martial law or violent oppression, which would theoretically have its own empirical piece of evidence that would say, for instance, in circumstances where people have risen up in revolution before, what we see as a response to that often is violent repressive action taken by the state. So there are several ways to go about contesting a position like this, but the first way that we want to talk about is making no warrant arguments. So, as we have been focusing on for the last few lectures, warrants are essential to proving the truth of any contention level or offensive argument you are making, to justifying the pieces of offense that you want to say affirm or negate the resolution. So people will often make no warrant arguments as defensive responses to their opponent's positions, which is to say, they might say that there's no reason why something is true. Now, there might be technical, we want to sort of divide the way that people make no warrant arguments between technical and substantive no warrant arguments, and this is sort of an important distinction. So in the first instance, technical no warrant arguments, you're literally saying that your opponent has not supplied a warrant for that being true. So if I say that civic disobedience violates the rule of law and that leads to domestic strife, and then I say, in instances of domestic strife, the government tends to violently respond. Here are 3 empirical examples of that being true. I've warranted the second claim. I've given 3 empirical pieces of evidence for instances in which repressive regimes have quashed violent revolution, but I haven't supplied a warrant for why antagonizing the rule of law through civic disobedience leads to domestic strife. So a technical no warrant argument would say that there's no reason why that's true in the opponent's position, so you simply can't evaluate the claim. Yeah? So technical no warrant arguments are important, and you should always be listening for whether or not your opponent is specifically articulating a warrant for an essential part of their narrative, or a part of their offensive argument. So that's a technical no warrant argument. It's when the opponent literally does not supply a warrant for that, and you're pointing out that that warrant is missing, and then explaining why that warrant would be essential for the argument to be true in the first place. So if I were to say there's no warrant to why the collapse of the rule of law leads to domestic strife, or why violating the rule of law leads to domestic strife, which is essential because otherwise there's no link between doing the resolutional action and creating domestic strife, so it might be the case that violent oppression responds to domestic strife, but we're not going to get there because there's no warrant for the first link. So in that circumstance, then, you're saying there's no warrant, but then you're going on to explain why it matters. So the second thing that you can do is make a substantive no warrant argument, which is to say that the warrant why that they're supplying is incorrect for whatever reason. So you can think about making this kind of no warrant argument in two ways. The first way would be to say that what they're saying is the warrant to their argument is actually not a warrant to their argument. So, for instance, if they're saying that the collapse of the rule of law leads to domestic strife, I might say that might be true, but there's no warrant to why the violations of the rule of law that you see in civic disobedience are the same as the collapse of the rule of law. So they're overstating what the implication in terms of the rule of law is. So what they're saying is a warrant for their claim is actually not a warrant for their claim. The second thing that I could do is substantively refute the truth of their warrant. So they might say that civic disobedience leads to the collapse of the rule of law, and I might say, no, that's not true, because in 4 empirical instances, we've seen that civic disobedience does not collapse the rule of law, so obviously this isn't true in any instance. So that's a defensive kind of no warrant argument, where you're saying that the warrant they're articulating is actually not a warrant because it is false. So in the first instance, then, the technical no warrant argument, you're simply pointing out that they're missing a step. And it's hard to come back from missing a step if it's a really integral part of your argument, but you have to make sure that that is compelling to your judge. In the second case of attacking the warrant to your opponent's position, you might be explaining why what they cast as being a warrant for their claim actually warrants some other claim and doesn't actually justify what they're saying it does, or you might give substantive reasons why their position is incorrect. And if you're giving substantive reasons why their position is incorrect, you probably are reading some kind of evidence that articulates that, in fact, the opposite has occurred, or that this has not occurred in the past, and that's part of the reason why you want to get prepared for these debates by writing blocks, is that you want to anticipate the types of arguments that they're going to be making, and you want evidence that says that exists purely to refute the warrants in their arguments. But we'll talk about blocking more in different lectures, and and I'm sure you will more in your interactions with other people in camp. The important part of this is that when you are making no warrant arguments, there's a difference between doing that technically and then substantively contesting the warrant that they're providing. And if you are substantively contesting the warrant that they're providing, you likely are going to have evidence that lets you do that somehow refutes the warrant that they're supplying, and especially if that warrant that they're supplying is an empirical warrant, like we talked about before, you're likely going to need some kind of empirical evidence to refute it. And we'll talk, again, more about evidence comparison later on. So we have no warrant arguments / contesting the warrant arguments. The next important part of this is making a no-link argument. A no-link argument. So a no-link argument works in 2 ways, typically. So the first way is that it makes the argument that in the argument that your opponent has articulated, there is either no link between affirming the resolution and the argument that you're making, or there's no link between the argument that they're making and the value criterion. These are the 2 typical ways that no-link arguments operate in LD rounds, and they're slightly distinct from how no-link arguments sometimes operate in policy rounds, so it's important to keep this in mind, that no-link arguments are typically saying, first, that there's no link between affirming the resolution and the argument that your opponent is making. So, for instance, in the last example that we were giving, we were saying that a collapse of the rule of law leads to domestic strife, which leads to violent state repression. A no-link argument would say that the resolution's action does not collapse the rule of law, so there is not a substantive link between the resolutional action and triggering the chain of events that they're using to generate offense. The second type of link would be to say that violent oppression, the impact, does not link back to their value criterion or your value criterion. And there would be a variety of ways to do this, but just to give a brief example, if we're both let's say, agreeing that utilitarianism is the framework in the round. If they're saying that the collapse of the rule of law leads to violent state repression, a no-link argument might be saying that they're actually not linking this back to the value criterion because they're not being explicitly comparative in saying that the violent repression caused by the state is worse than the violent repression that civic disobedience was a response to in the first place. In order to impact back to a utilitarian framework, you need to prove that there is a net benefit to doing X. So proving that there is a benefit without comparing it against its consequences doesn't link back to the value criterion. And you can think about a variety of reasons why any given argument doesn't link back to a given value criterion, and each one of these could be made as a sort of no-link argument that says that they're not linking their argument back to the value criterion. But these are different types of no-link arguments, and it's important to keep this distinction in mind. The first being that there's no link between doing the resolution and what they're actually saying is going to happen in the contention level argument, or what the contention level is talking about is not the same thing as what the resolutional action is, and the second one being that their contention level argument does not link back to the value criterion. This third type of no-link argument is a more specific type of no-link argument that is called no internal link. So this is to say, as opposed to saying their contention level argument doesn't link to the resolution or doesn't link to their value criterion, is to say that the logic that makes up their contention has a missing internal link or a missing step along the way that would be necessary for them to prove that the resolution is indeed false or is indeed true. So an example here would be if I am making the argument that we've been talking about how the collapse of rule of law leads to domestic strife, leads to martial law, and violent repression on the behalf of the government as a response. If I am not reading evidence that says the collapse of rule of law leads to domestic strife, or if I'm not reading evidence that says responses to domestic strife are oftentimes violent on behalf of the state, if I'm missing any of those links, or if I'm missing the link between the collapse of rule of law and domestic strife, those would be missing internal links. So I'm creating this lengthy series of arguments, and if I'm not substantiating, or if I'm not articulating the link between each one of them. So if I, for instance, say the collapse of the rule of law, that civic disobedience leads to the collapse of rule of law, which leads to martial law and violent oppression, and I'm not making the argument that violence and oppression, which is response to domestic strife, is caused by the collapse of the rule of law, I am missing an internal link inside of my contention level narrative. So what we're trying to emphasize here is that a missing internal link is a missing step in the chain of the story that your opponent is telling, and you need to make sure that if they have a narrative that leads to from the resolution's action to a given consequence, that they are articulating and justifying every step of that argument. If they're not justifying a step, that is a missing link. If the step is not substantiated, that is a missing warrant, and that's the idea behind the distinction between the two. Now, we're basically out of time here. In fact, we're probably a little bit over. There are two other types of arguments that we should talk about very briefly. The first one is empirically denied. Empirically denied. And that's to say, that's a way of making a defensive response to your opponent's position where you say, you are saying that this is going to happen or that this is true, but in the real world, empirical evidence has never borne out the consequence that you're drawing from a given cause. So, for instance, we actually used an example of this before. If we're saying that civic disobedience collapses the rule of law, your response might be empirically denied. Civic disobedience has happened 1 billion times over the course of history, and in very few instances has it led to the real collapse of the rule of law, so that causal effect is empirically denied. Just a phrase that it's useful to know. And then, finally, non-unique. A non-unique is an argument that you make when you say that whatever negative effect that your opponent is talking about would also happen on the affirmative side, or also happen on the negative side. So it washes out, and you have to evaluate other offense on those grounds. So, an example of a non-unique then would be to say, if you're saying that civic disobedience leads to the collapse of the rule of law, not allowing for civic disobedience also leads to the collapse of rule of law because people lose faith in the law and aren't able to check it. So, in both circumstances, we see the collapse of the rule of law. So, that impact then is what we would call non-unique, meaning it is not only true to one side, it is true to both sides. And that's the last defensive argument that we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about rebuttal strategy and putting things together more as you proceed throughout camp, but this is hopefully a useful starting vocabulary for starting to think about approaching rebuttals.